I live in Los Angeles, and I go to a book club that meets once a month. And last night, I just finished the book that we're going to read for March. And I wanted to talk about it because I think it's an important book. And it's an important book, especially right now in America in 2025. It's a book I've read once before. And it's interesting because it's a book that does a lot of things at once. On the one hand, it's almost certainly one of the greatest science fiction novels ever published. But more than that, I think it might also be one of the greatest political novels ever published. In fact, you might be able to argue that it is the great political novel of our era, just as important as 1984 and Brave New World and The Handmaid's Tale were for the eras in which they were published. And the book I'm talking about is this book. I'll hold it up here. It's called The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin. Now, maybe you've heard of Ursula K. Le Guin, maybe you haven't. Ursula K. Le Guin, who passed away several years ago, was an American writer of science fiction and fantasy books. And she was probably, you could probably make the case that she was, for a time, maybe like the most well-regarded, well-respected writer in the field. That she was sort of like at the peak of what you can do with the science fiction and fantasy genres. She won numerous literary awards throughout her life, was very well celebrated and well loved for pretty much most of her career. And this book in particular, The Dispossessed, holds an interesting distinction in the world of kind of science fiction. So there's just like there's Pulitzer Prizes and National Book Awards, for works of quote unquote literary fiction in the U.S. We also have, some literary awards for genre fiction, for science fiction. When The Dispossessed came out, it won all three of the major science fiction literary awards for the year in which it was published. It won the Hugo Award, the Nebula Award, and the Locus Award. And that puts it on a very short list of books. Only about 11 books have ever done that. And Le Guin has written 2 of them. The other book she wrote that has that distinction is The Left Hand of Darkness. And it's probably not a coincidence that the writers whose books are on that very short list tend to be some of the more esteemed people in the field, people like Arthur C. Clarke, as well as William Gibson, as well as Anne Leckie, and a couple of others who I can't think of off the top of my head, unfortunately. So first, we'll start with like a little bit of background. So The Dispossessed was published way back in 1974. And just as kind of a quick refresher, 1974 was a very fraught and very intense year for the United States of America. We had just wrapped up the Vietnam War. We'd finally gotten out of Vietnam and the sheer debacle that was the previous year in 1973. But 1974 is a very notorious year in American history. If you recall from your high school American history classes, if you learned about it, it's the year of Watergate. It's the year in which Richard Nixon, who's then the president of the United States, basically, resigned his office as a result of the Watergate scandal, and Gerald Ford became president. And then Ford pardoned Nixon, which outraged many people, and is probably why Ford only won a single term. But that's just to give you an idea of kind of what sort of the climate that this book was published in. Right, it was published at a time of enormous strain and tension within American society, in some ways similar to the strain and tension we see today, although the problems we have today are much more different. Excuse me, much more different. Sorry. I'm just recording this live, by the way, so I'm not doing like a bunch of clips. So if you hear me make flubs, I apologize in advance. But so The Dispossessed, in some ways, is a like I said, it's a science fiction and a political novel, but it's a type of novel that is actually kind of older than either of those genres in a way. And what it is a novel about utopia, or the idea of like what would a perfect society look like. The first, I think common example we have of utopia was written by Thomas More, who's a British writer, hundreds of years ago. And it's this book has a very interesting take on it. And a lot of times The Dispossessed, when it's appeared in print, has come with like a little subheading called The Dispossessed, an ambiguous utopia. And Le Guin herself referred to it as an ambiguous utopia. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means. But I thought I would start kind of just by giving you kind of some context for the book and helping you kind of like understand like, well, what is happening. So The Dispossessed does not take place on Earth at all. There are several humans who are featured in it, so humanity does show up in a very small, limited, but important way. But the book is really about, it's not really about one society, but it's about two societies that are on two separate worlds. One of these worlds is called Urus, or Urus. And Urus is in some ways kind of similar to Earth. It is governed by nation states that compete for resources. Free market capitalism seems to be kind of the name of the game, right? And its capital is heavily entangled with the governments of those worlds, right? So they sort of work together. It's a society built on a very, kind of rigid and powerful sense of hierarchy, right? Some people have a lot. Some people have not very much at all. Some people starve, just like they do on Earth. And so when the book opens, or as the book opens, we learn that 170 years, several generations before the present moment when the book starts, there was a revolution, a big upheaval on Urus. And the upheaval was not necessarily led by, but inspired by a woman and a thinker named Odo. And Odo was what today we would probably refer to as kind of like someone who was sort of like an anarchist, if you will, someone who really opposed the ideas of really just kind of having structures and hierarchies being kind of the dominant things that run society. Odo is a big believer in what we would call, mutual aid, and the idea that people always need to organize organically on their own to share burdens and responsibilities and meet their needs. At any rate, 170 years, like I said, before the start of the book, this woman, Odo, who spent a lot of her time in prison, or that's what the book implies is what happened to her, her ideas became very popular and started to spread. And that led to a big social revolution on Urus. And the revolutionaries, they grew in size, and they started to become incredibly disruptive, too disruptive to just easily get rid of or to put down. And so the government on Urus basically cut a deal with these revolutionaries, because Urus is orbited by a moon, and the moon of Urus, unlike the moon of Earth, is habitable. That moon is called Anaris. And so the powers that be on Urus, the parent world, they cut a deal with the revolutionaries, and they said, hey, if you promise to leave and never come back, we will basically give you the moon. We will give you Anaris to live on, right? You can take our spaceships. We will send you there, and you can just go live there. But once you do, that's the final settlement, right? There's no coming back. You'll have to make your own lives up there. And basically, the revolutionaries agreed to that. And so they took a bunch of rocket ships up to the moon, Anaris, and they basically created their own world and their own society up on that moon, built around Odo's principles. Odo herself didn't get to go, unfortunately. She was the inspiration for this revolution, but she wasn't the person like spearheading it. And so, for the last 170 years, the people on Anaris, the Anaresti as they call themselves, they have built up their own kind of anarcho-syndicalist society, right? A society built around the principles of shared burdens and of mutual aid, right? It's a non-hierarchical society. Everyone is equal. Everyone is equally free. No one has the power, at least not officially, to coerce anyone or force anyone to do anything that they don't want to do. Anaris, as a moon, is kind of it's a bit like the American Southwest, if you will, or a bit like a desert. Like there's some oceans on it, but it's a pretty barren planet. Urus, the homeworld, the exploitive capitalist world, is a very resplendent world. It is abundant in natural resources. It overteems with forests and oceans and rivers and incredibly beautiful and lush wildlife. Anaris is an impoverished world. And it's given to these revolutionaries to basically just get rid of them, right? To just basically say, you're too much of a problem for our society here on Urus. So just go live on the moon, go live on Anaris, go away and never come back, please. And they do. And the Dispossessed, like I said, takes place on both worlds. on Urus and Anaris about 170 years after the planet has basically been settled by these revolutionaries. And the main character in the Dispossessed is a man, and his name is Shevik. His name is only Shevik because people on Anaris, he's from the moon, he's the descendants of these revolutionaries. People on Anaris only have a single name, which is given to them by kind of by a computer system. They still have computers up there and some advanced technology that helps them sort of compute things and make kind of like decisions about how to organize things and, detailing, work, kind of like work dispatches and stuff and who does what labor. But Shevik is kind of a problematic guy because Shevik is a theoretical physicist. In theoretical physics, on a world that is built on these kind of old principles of like anarchic self-reliance, is a difficult place to be in. And Shevik himself, the character, is actually modeled after Dr. Robert J. Oppenheimer, the grandfather of the father of the atomic bomb, as he's called in the U.S. Ursula K. Guin's parents, when she was young, they were actually friends with Oppenheimer. She knew Oppenheimer, in fact, when she was younger, I believe. And so Shevik is kind of designed or inspired by Robert J. Oppenheimer, right? He is a brilliant, world-beatingly good physicist. His ideas are revolutionary, more revolutionary even than this revolutionary world that he lives on. But like a lot of people who are gifted with savant-level abilities in technical fields, Shevik is an outsider, right? So he lives in what is basically an exiled society, but he himself, on top of that, is also something of an exile within that society as well, right? He's a loner. He tends to be very isolated and to be very inwardly focused on kind of his own inner world and the scientific problems that plague him in physics. And as the book opens, we learn that Shevik is doing something unthinkable. He has decided to return to Urus. He's never been there. No one from Anaris has been to Urus in 170 years. It's sort of been forbidden by Anaresti society, right? The settlement was closed 170 years ago. We will not go back. But Shevik has decided, okay, it's been 170 years and I'm going to return. And as we learn, Shevik has a couple of different motives for this. One is that he has kind of grown increasingly politically conscious of the fact that there's something missing when these two societies that have the same people living in them have been apart for so long. But more than that, we learn that Shevik, who is a theoretical physicist, is working on a theory that is so big and so powerful that it has the power to change everything. And without getting into all the rigmarole and the details of that, basically, Shevik has figured out a theory and some mathematical formulas that when applied, will basically allow for more or less instantaneous communication and travel through space. At the beginning of this book, at the beginning of The Dispossessed, the most advanced technology amongst all of like the sentient beings in the universe is still like using ships that travel like a little slower than the speed of light, right? Pretty close to it, but pretty slow, right? It still takes enormous amounts of time to pass across these sort of, cosmic distances, right? What Shevik has in his mind is, ironically, for a man coming from an anarchist society where there is no money and where everything is shared, Shevik, ironically, possesses the single most unfathomably invaluable thing, right? He possesses knowledge that will revolutionize every civilized planet in the galaxy. And there's more than one civilized planet in the galaxy in Le Guin's world. There's technically about 9 of them, but that's not terribly important for the time being. And so Shevik is basically going back to the homeworld to, meet with, kind of work with some physicists at a university, or so he thinks that's what he's going to do. And he's also trying to figure out, well, what am I to do with this theory, right? What's the best way to share this knowledge? The people on Anaris, where he's born and lived his whole life, they don't seem to want the idea. They don't value it because they have no real use for it in Anaresti society, right? Anaresti society is purely concerned with getting by, abiding by the principles of Odo, and doing its best to survive. And so Shevik is the main character in this book, and the book basically is told from kind of two different points of view. It's told in the present in chapters where we see Shevik going down to Urus and figuring out what he's going to do there. And that's interspaced with kind of, what do you call them, like flashback chapters, where we follow Shevik on Anaris, where he was born and raised, and we see what life is like for him there and for all of the rest of the Anaresti, right? These people who live in this society of seemingly perfect equality. And so Le Guin gives us an impression, an incredibly gorgeously detailed impression of the societies of two different worlds, of a world and the habitable moon that orbits it, right? One is a society that is relentlessly, rapaciously capitalistic and hierarchical, much like ours is. And the other is a society that is relentlessly, militantly flat, that refuses any form of structure or hierarchy that isn't mutually agreed upon by everyone. And so, what this book does is it shows us these two separate societies. And the thing that Le Guin does that's clever, right? You would think, okay, so like clearly Anaris is like meant to be the utopian world where everything is shared, right? And Urus is meant to be, you know, the anti-utopia, the miserable hellscape that, you know, we recognize so well. Le Guin doesn't let us get out that easily, though. She's too smart to do that. This is not a juvenile idea of utopia. Like I said, the sort of subtitle of the book is an ambiguous utopia. Because one thing we learn early on, we see Shevik having these experiences when he lands on Urus, the homeworld, and he's whisked about in a limousine, and he goes to a university, and he's given these great quarters, and he's, you know, accorded all of this respect. You know, the first person to visit in 170 years, a globally recognized physicist, right? An important scientific thinker. What we see is that, at least at first, Shevik is hypnotized and allured enormously by what he encounters on Urus, right? Coming from the desert moon, where life is difficult and hardscrabble, where sometimes the growing seasons aren't long enough, sometimes they have famines on Anaris, right? Anaris is a world where they create and produce and manufacture just what they need and nothing more. And so as a result of that, you know, they don't have these giant economies of scale that they do on Urus or like they would on Earth, right? There's not an enormous surplus on this barren, resource-scarce desert world. And so Shevik is utterly, you know, kind of, he's not suckered in, but he's overwhelmed by the richness and the sheer overflowing plenitude of this world. Urus has everything. It has unimaginable wealth. It has beautiful oceans, forests, and trees. There's an incredibly moving description early in the book where Shevik, he's given this very seemingly palatial apartment at the university, something he's not used to because on Anaris, everyone lives in a dormitory, right? Again, living accommodations are shared there as well. There is no private property on Anaris. There is no private residency. You don't own a home. No one owns anything. And so he's given this incredibly palatial, you know, apartment, which he's sort of weirded out by, right? He's like, well, where are all my roommates? You know, this is a room for the size of 10 people. And someone has to explain to him. He said, no, Shevik, this is all for you, right? But there's this incredibly touching scene where he wakes up his first or second day on the planet, and he opens a window, and he hears this incredibly beautiful, piercing, shrill singing sound. It's bird song. There are no birds on Anaris. Shevik is in his 40s, and he's never, ever heard the singing of birds. It's just like, and it's one of those incredibly minuscule details. A lesser writer wouldn't think to include it, right? But it's one of those tiny little moments of like unbelievable beauty where you realize more about someone in kind of a sci-fi universe than you would from tens of pages of blown out, you know, info dumping and exposition and description, right? There are no animals on Anaris, or virtually no animals, right? There are no birds. There is no natural beauty on this world to speak of. It is a hard scrabble and difficult place to live. At any rate, so Shevik is, you know, taken in by all this, and, you know, they award him this, you know, huge physics prize that he won years ago, but he just couldn't collect. And everyone is treating him with so much deference and respect, and they're taking him around, and he's doing like all these touristy things. And he's giving, you know, these sort of grand speeches about, oh, you know, we need to have brotherhood between the worlds and blah, 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 and all that. And interspaced between those chapters in the present moment, like I said, we're seeing Shevik's background and what it's like being raised on Anaris. And Le Guin does just an incredible job. In some ways, it feels more like an anthropological study than a book. And this is something I've read maybe 3 of Le Guin's novels now. Le Guin has a sense that almost no other writer has, even in genre fiction or literary fiction or elsewhere, of kind of the texture and the filigree of what it is to describe a different society. She feels more like an anthropologist than someone who's making this up whole cloth, which she is, of course. These aren't real worlds. And we start by seeing Shevik when he's just a small baby, when he's being raised in a collective nursery. And we learn very quickly that on Anaris, because no one owns anything, children are also not owned. There aren't really personal pronouns used on Anaris at all. There is no mine. There is no my. There are no my parents. You refer to your mother and father as the mother. Excuse me, as the mother and the father, right? And that's one of those tiny little things or an example where language reveals something so fundamental and so powerful, right? You could spend pages trying to describe it, but Le Guin just does it by saying, oh, actually, it's very simple, right? The possessive article, my, doesn't exist. No one on Anaris uses that. They struggle to even understand what it is because it's not part of the language that they use. And that's another incredible thing that Le Guin does in this book, right? Because we see that Shevik, when he first goes to Uras, where they speak a different language, Shevik is having a hard time understanding because he speaks the language of that world. He's learned it on his own, which not many people do on Anaris, right? He's learned the language of Uras, but the concepts aren't cemented in his head. Personal property is something he has no knowledge of, right? And that's one way that Le Guin really kind of shows us or kind of begs some questions about, well, what would a utopia be like, right? A utopia, as Le Guin has it, it's not simply about who has what or doesn't have what. It's not about how resources are allocated or about how power is shared, right? The first and foremost difference that we need to think about when talking about a fundamentally alien society, different society, is what is a difference in the language, right? How do these people use words, and what do those words help us to understand about their understanding of the world? The book is called The Dispossessed, right? Anaris is the world of the dispossessed, those who are not owners, those who possess nothing. In fact, on Anaris, being an owner, being a profiteer, those are like the most common slurs that they use, right? There's lots of propaganda telling them that Uras is still bad 170 years later, and then you'll find out why, of course. But that's just another one of those, kind of brilliant ways where Le Guin, instead of, having a lot of tedious exposition, she dives into, well, how do these people's minds work? Because how is their relationship to the language they use? What would the language be of a people who don't have a concept of private property? Because their language, the way the concepts in their head that are cemented in their language, they're going to be different, right? Ownership as an idea, as a concept, private property as a concept, creates a different mindset, a different reality, a different linguistic reality, right? And that's one thing that she does so brilliantly in this book. At any rate, we learn an awful lot about Anaris, right? So again, everything is held in common, right? Not only is there no private property, but again, families, you don't have, they're not your mother and your father, they are the mother and the father, right? The raising of children is a profoundly communal activity. And one of the more jarring things we learn in the book, at least jarring to those of us who were raised on Earth, I think, in most societies, is that the family unit, as we understand it, doesn't really exist on Anaris. And it's not that children don't sometimes live with the parents that they have, but past a certain age, past about 4 or 5, children are usually put into public dormitories, right? And they are forced into the public space because, again, there really is no private space in Anaris. There is a concept of partnership, right? They do have sort of something akin to what we call marriage, but even that, like, you just take basically a double room inside of a dormitory, right? Everything happens out in the open. Everything is public on Anaris. Even a partnership, a romantic entanglement that lasts a lifetime, is still largely for public consumption, if you will. And so we learn a lot of other things about Anaris too, right? So, for example, they get their food from dining halls. Again, there are no private restaurants, right? If you need clothing, there's like a clothing depot where you go. You simply take what you need, right? because this is not a society where anyone purchases anything. There is no currency on this world, because there are really, like, there aren't commodities in the sense that you and I have them, in the sense that there are commodities that, are converted into finished goods, right? All of the commodities and the finished goods that come out of them are shared in common, right? You take, on Anaris, in this society, you just take what you need. And there isn't much to take anyway in general, right? You take as much food as you need from the dining hall. You take as much clothing as you need. You're assigned a dormitory to live with. There is an organization called DivLab, or the Division of Labor, if you will. And you request the type of work that you want to do, whether it's teaching classes or digging ditches or doing metal work or electric work or any of the other numerous things that it takes to keep a society running. Like I said, Anaris is an impoverished society, but it's still modern. They still have computers, and it's sort of implied, that they do have kind of some primitive particle accelerators, right? It is still a modern society, right? They're not living in caves. They still have electricity, and they still have like a simple train system, and they've got some dirigibles that fly around, And interestingly, and here's where Le Guin brilliantly makes things more ambiguous, right? It's not necessarily true that Anaris and Urus, the capitalist homeworld, they're actually not quite as isolated as they seem. There is still kind of a problematic relationship between them, because it turns out that about 8 times a year, the people on Urus, they send rocket ships up to Anaris to collect minerals and rare metals that are mined on Anaris, right? And so that's sort of the trade-off that the Anaresti up on the moon on Anaris have made, right? They get to keep the moon in exchange for giving up some of the resources, the rare metals, which they don't have a use for. They don't have much use for gold on Anaris, right? Because they don't. Again, there's no concept of wealth there, and so they basically the Orasti have this incredible deal where they just send rockets up, and the Anaresti just sort of give up their valuable resources or resources that don't have value to an anarchist society. They just give those up because they don't know what gold, or they know what gold is, but they don't have a conception of its value because there is no concept of that type of value in that society, right? And so Le Guin, again, being such a brilliant writer, right? She throws a wrench into the works at every possible stop that she can, right? How does a utopia, a world that's a utopia, or a nation that's a utopia, how does that utopia interact with other nations that maybe aren't utopian or that have different ways of organization? Because the worlds are interconnected, right? This world is being mined for the sake of the parent world. And it's sort of implied that, like, there's this easy kind of truce, right? There's a lot of people on Anaris who don't want to send any of these resources back to Urus, to the homeworld, not because they're greedy to keep them. There is no real greed on Anaris, but because they're mistrustful. They're like, well, hold on, we're doing business with these sort of evil capitalist profiteers that we left behind 170 years ago, right? This is a point of contention in the society on Anaris, right? Why are we doing effectively, sullying ourselves by getting involved with the trading of commodities and goods with these evil capitalists? We came here to get away from this, and yet we haven't truly escaped, right? We're still a little entangled with it, right? We're not so isolated that there isn't still a little bit of what we would call trade. Now, the Anaresti do get some things, like when the spaceships come up from Urus, from the homeworld, right? They send them up intellectual material like scientific journals, as well as like some rare medicines and anesthesias and things they can't produce, right? So even in this radical anarchist, hyper individual socialist seeming utopia, there is still kind of this uncomfortable tension, right? That, well, there are other worlds, other nations, if you will, in our area that we still have kind of this tenuous interaction with. And the real reason, and you might think, oh, well, why don't they just, forbid the ships from coming from the homeworld? And the reason, of course, is because the Anaresti are actually kind of scared, right? They have no military. They have no defense. They have sort of a defense force, but they don't have weapons or any of those things in any meaningful sense, right? The Urasti, the homeworld, they've got a bunch of weapons. They've got warships that they can send to the moon. The Anaresti are scared that if they ever stop sending the minerals back, that the settlement will just be ignored, right? And that Urus will come in their space warships. They'll just come to the moon and they'll take what they want by force. And very likely impose martial law or whatever, or some oppressive, dominant, hierarchical system on the Anaresti, right? So Anaris has lived for 170 years in this kind of ambiguous, tense state where it's sort of been allowed to flourish as it wants in isolation, aside from occasional bits of problematic trade that it has with the parent world. And so that is, like I said, that's just one of the tensions that Le Guin throws kind of into the works, right? And she does this in a lot of different ways, right? Anaris, in theory, doesn't have a government. They have this thing called PDC, which is like, I think it stands for like production coordination. And that's not a government or an administration, but really it kind of is, right? Those are the kind of collections of representatives from the different syndicates on Anaris, the different like collectives that do actually argue, have parliamentary debates, and sort of, they don't make decisions, but they discourage decisions they don't like, right? And that opprobrium bleeds out into society. So there actually is a lot of pressure to conform with whatever decisions happen in the PDC, right? And Le Guin isn't doing this to say, oh, well, look at the Anaresti, oh, anarchists are hypocrites or whatever, right? What she's doing is pointing out the very real reality, which is that structures of power tend to accrete no matter what kind of society you live in, right? The capital of Anaris, where Shevik lives, is called Abinay, I think that's how it's pronounced. And there's a really great line. So Shevik is the main character in the book. He's not originally from there. He's from a smaller town and he moves there. Before he moves there, an older professor of his or a mentor of his says, be careful, Shevik. Power inheres at a center, and Abinay is a center, right? So even the Anaresti, the people up on this moon, they still understand that, well, that's not quite true, right? Not everyone is truly as equal, right? The influence and sway of a big urban center like Abinay, that is real in our society. It's a problem. We know it's a problem. And it's a tension and a form of ambiguity that all of us, as idealistic as the people in Anaris are, all of us here have to basically live with it, right? At any rate. So, like I said, we learn a lot about the society of Anaris from Shevik's flashbacks, and we start to see some of the that this society is in some ways or at least to us, is a very dissatisfying place to live in certain ways, right? Excuse me. There isn't always a lot to go around. They have to have special corvees and shipments to move things around. If you need surgery, sometimes you have to wait a long time because the anesthesia you would need has to be shipped in from somewhere else. They don't have robust surpluses and inventories of stuff on stock, right? This is a world where everything is shared, but there isn't a lot to share. Anaris is not a rich world, as I've said before. And so we start to see that, behind the scenes, well, some of the things on Anaris, are maybe not as perfect as they seem. The grand ideals of Odo, the person who created this or who envisioned this whole society, are not quite as perfectly ideal as they seem. There is still sort of this, kind of force of social coercion, the desire to go along to get along, which is present in all human societies, that Le Guin points out. And so, again, what she's doing here in terms of the structure of the book is so brilliant, because what Le Guin does, she starts out describing the sort of yucky capitalist homeworld, saying, well, actually, there's a lot here that, at least on the surface, is really, really great. And there's a lot on Anaris that, at least on the surface, maybe doesn't seem so great, right? Anaris, for anyone who's not from there, doesn't necessarily seem like the greatest or happiest place to live. Surely a world like Urus, with all of its bounty and plenitude and its surplus and its sort of seemingly meritocratic society where, oh, well, if you work hard, you can get ahead. We've all heard that before, right? That type of world is alluring, is appealing. And again, that's one of the brilliant things about Le Guin's writing, right? There's an old saying, right? That, or what is it like? When the devil comes to you, he comes, he doesn't come as the devil. He comes as someone as a seductive figure, right? Urus is seductive, right? The capitalist meritocracy, on the surface, it is seductive, especially if you've lived in a place that has been so impoverished and has so little and has had so little for so long. And like I said, Shevik is kind of overwhelmed by this. He sort of loses himself, and he doesn't become like a craven, profiteer or profit motive driven person, right? but he starts to see that a lot of the ideology he was raised with, which was created in a direct response to Urasti society, that Urasti society has its own weird kind of ambiguities and complexities, just like Anaris does, as all societies do, right? For the first time in his life, Shevik is understanding, or gets the experience that no one else in these two worlds has had, to see both of these societies as what they are, right? He's the only person, the only one in 170 years who's had a living experience now on both of these worlds. And what Le Guin does, to kind of getting back to talking about the structure of this, that's so brilliant. At first, like I said, Urus, the capitalist parent world, sounds like such a great place to live, and Anaris sounds like, it's not so great, like there are famines on Anaris, right? We learn a few years before the book starts that there was a terrible famine. And that a lot of people had to starve. Basically, everyone was kind of living on emergency rations. There were revolts. People started to get violent. It started to seem like this, powerful egalitarian society built on perfect equality and sharing couldn't actually survive a crisis like a major famine. But they did manage to sort of come through it. But it's obvious that the society on Anaris is still very scarred, very shaken from this kind of basic existential threat it faced with hunger a couple years ago. At any rate, as the book moves on, Le Guin flips the script on us, of course, right? She shows that, what we start to see and I'm not going to spoil it too much, but what we start to see in the later half of the books is that the sort of glittering, gorgeous surface of Urus, of the capitalist world, Shevik starts to see beneath the facade, and the things he sees beneath the facade become increasingly alarming, increasingly dark, and increasingly violent. And as we spend more and more time on Anaris, we see some of the hypocrisy in Anaresti society, right? But in a lot of ways, Anaresti society doesn't have levels and layers to it because it's a self-organized society, right? You don't have to figure out the power dynamics because there really aren't very many dynamics of power at all, right? There's forms of tension and pressure, but everything is out in the open in this society. Everything is shared. Everything is radically equal, or as equal as you could probably make it, right? And so we start to see that Anaresti society, the society on the moon, is unsatisfying in a lot of ways. But where power lies because it lies with you and everyone else, right? Whereas the society on Urus, the capitalist world, we see, that this society does have layers, does have complexity, does have this labyrinth that you have to navigate, right? And one thing that Shevik struggles with comically over and over again is reading what we think of as subtext, right? Reading between the lines. Well, who's really in charge, right? Because in a world without equality, someone is definitely in charge, right? Someone has more power than you. Someone has more money than you. And so figuring out those rules and what you can and can't do, that becomes an entire psychological game, right? That monopolizes your energy and resources, and Shevik gets super frustrated and flustered in all sorts of comical ways that those of us living on Earth, would find amusing, right? Now I will say, towards the end of the book, there's a really interesting and really powerful interaction because, as I said earlier, there are humans in this book, and we meet one of them. So in the sort of Le Guin wrote a number of novels that are set in this universe where the Dispossessed is, and Earth is one of them too. Earth is referred to as Terra in this book, and the people who live in it and are from it are called Terrans. So human beings are called Terrans, right? The people on Anaris and Urus, they're not human beings. They're humanoid, right? They're close enough to us, but it's implied like we have sort of a common ancestor, but we look different. At any rate, at one point late in the book, Shevik actually meets a human, like one of us from Earth, and he's had a lot of experiences on Urus, and he's been he's been through the ringer a little bit. I won't spoil it, but he's talking to this ambassador from Earth, and he's basically asking for asylum because he wants to get away from Urus. He sees it for what it is now, and he's describing it to the ambassador from Earth, and he's saying, listen, I know you're from Terra. He said, you have to understand, on Anaris, we're raised to believe that Urus is hell. I've lived on an Urus. Shevik has lived on Urus for a year now, and he says, our ancestors were right to leave. Urus, this is hell. This is the worst possible world. And the Terran ambassador, the human ambassador, an incredibly dark but funny moment. She just sort of grimaces and she laughs and she says, Shevik, it's so interesting hearing your perspective on this. She said, when those of us on Earth look at Urus, we regard it as a paradise. And Shevik is like, well, what do you mean? And the ambassador, and again, this takes place, millennia in the future, she says, Shevik, Anaris is an impoverished world that is a moon that orbits a wealthier world. But those two worlds are still functional. She says, Earth in this novel is a ruin. It's a ruin. They don't even have as much as the people on Anaris, on the desert planet, do. And we learn in brutally short order, like it's like a single paragraph where Le Guin just like ruthlessly eviscerates humanity. We learned that at one point there were 9 billion people on Earth, and that humanity has just done such a piss poor job of managing its resources and its economies that Earth has been completely depleted. Earth is a ghost town. There's nothing left, and it's basically one of the other spacefaring sentient races in this book who are called the Hainish. Hainish, I think that's right. It's the Hainish basically who were the ones who invented interstellar travel at first. They came to Earth and they basically gave humanity spaceships and tried to help them a little bit. The Hainish took pity on us, right? Humanity, those 500 million people of the 9 billion there were, the 500 million who survived, that tiny fraction, the only reason we've survived is because a more advanced race of beings found us and in their altruism took pity on us and saved us from ourselves. So, all of that happens in like a single ruthless paragraph in the Dispossessed, right? And again, the way that Le Guin lays it out, right? You think when you're reading the book, it's like, so is Urus meant to be Earth, and is Anaris meant to be, communist or, Russia or the USSR or whatever? Le Guin pulls the rug out from under you, as she always does. She says, no. She says, this is not that simple. She said, these two societies, as gross and problematic as the capitalist hellscape Urus is, and as noble but impoverished as Anaris, the desert moon, is, as different and as problematic as each of these worlds are, both of these worlds are still infinitely more functional than the Earth that humanity destroyed for themselves. Anyway, like I said, The Dispossessed is one of those books that asks a lot of questions about, like, well, what would a more perfect society look like? And Le Guin's answer is that, well, it's actually never going to be perfect, right? There's always going to be tensions. Power is always going to accrete, right? Power will always adhere to a center. Power will always, in any kind of society, be concentrated in some hands. Even in a society as radically dedicated to individualism and individual action and mutual aid and shared responsibility as Anaris is. And like I said, that's why it's an ambiguous utopia, right? Le Guin is not naive. She's no fool. The brilliance of The Dispossessed is that ultimately she shows us the shortcomings in either of these societies, right? They're both flawed, both problematic. They both get things wrong. And the things they get wrong, some of it is solvable, and some of it, she sort of implies, is just due to this brutal thing we call human nature, right? There is an interesting moment at the very first chapter of the book when we see Shevik when he's just a baby, when Shevik's dad is taking care of him, the father, and Shevik's in a nursery being tended to by a nurse, and Shevik keeps pointing at things and saying, "Mine, it's mine," or like oh, my bottle, my rag, my son, or whatever. And the nurse constantly has to correct him, and she says, "It is not yours, Shevik. Nothing is yours. It's free to use. It is for everyone," right? And I think the point that Le Guin is trying to make here, right, is that maybe the concept of something being yours, of possessing something, is just sort of built into the nature of the people on this world, who are not humans like we are, but are close enough to us, right? That maybe there's just something about humanoid beings in this universe where the concept of possessiveness is just something that is sort of ingrained into us, or it's an easy shortcut, right? Le Guin goes into kind of like a lot of different detail, and the characters in these books have lots of interesting kind of they're not like political conversations and sort of philosophical conversations about like, well, what does it even mean to own something or to not own something, right? And she's The Dispossessed is just, it's a book that is so incredibly beautifully richly told that elaborates two vastly different worlds with a gorgeous, like I said, almost anthropologist's eye for idiosyncrasy and detail. It's a book that's intensely worth reading, and I think it's a book that's intensely worth reading right now. In America in 2025, we are faced with what increasingly seems like a gruesome and ugly kind of inflection point. We have a hard time imagining what the future could look like, or if there will even be a meaningful political future as we understand it outside of the crisis and chaos that the current administration has us embedded in. But books like this are more necessary in times like this. Books that elaborate a utopia, no matter how fictional it is, those things become more essential as we get more cynical, right? Because they force us to say, well, sure, like our cynicism is a byproduct of the world as it is, but the ability to, Guin has a brilliant saying she made in a speech once. She said, she described capitalism as being like the divine right of kings, right? It seemed the divine right of kings, or she said, capitalism seems implacable and immutable and eternal. So did the divine right of kings. And she has a beautiful line where she says, any idea that is created by the human mind can be uncreated and turned into something better by the human mind, right? The world we live in ultimately is a human creation. It's the creation of all of us. And all of us have the ability to change it and make it something better. That's not an idealistic statement. That is a bluntly pragmatic fact. And so what's interesting is that Le Guin, who in this book, at first you're like, oh, this is like, seems like so treacly and naive. But when you get to the end of it, you realize like, no, she's making the point actually that political change actually is pragmatic, is grounded, is down to earth, is based in reality. Being stuck perpetually in an unchangeable status quo, that's actually what doesn't last. That's what's unnatural. That's actually much more silly and much more naive in some ways. At any rate, I spent a while talking to you all about this. I appreciate you all listening. Like I said, the book is called The Dispossessed. It's by Ursula K. Le Guin. Came out in 1974. They just released a 50th anniversary edition. Like I said, it's one of the most celebrated science fiction novels and also one of the best political novels ever written. It's absolutely worth everyone's time to read, especially I think if you live in America in the year 2025. It's time to dream big. Thanks for your time.